then can Alex hear?
So when they're all get in, we'll give them a bit of time to prepare for the rest of it.
So it's just like.
I'll let you know when it's checked their ID.
Okay, so that's why I'm watching that. Oh, great. Okay.
And phone set to silent, please, everyone.
Oh God.
Sorry to be that guy in the cinema. Okay, people are starting to enter now, so I'll stop speaking and I'll give you a couple of thumbs up.
Welcome to Robo Poe, which is our poetry reading with Clea Mesmer, who is a robot. And we've been lucky enough to be hosting Cleo for the last 2 weeks at Sussex. She's designed by Engineered Arts. We're exploring really today what constitutes a poetry reading when we're working with a robot. And I'd like to thank everyone who has sent in poems for Cleo to read. My name's Carol Watts and I'm a poet and I'll be taking part in this in a while, but I'd like to introduce to you first Evelyn Ficarra. Evelyn is a composer and is working on a long project called the Robot Opera, and the Robo Poe event today is just the first part of that. There's a robot opera happening tomorrow. And Evelyn's just going to say a few words about what she's been doing and what it means to work with a robot in thinking about poetry and opera. Over to you.
Thank you, Carol. I'd like to first acknowledge the Media Arts and Humanities Research Funding for Knowledge Exchange and the Sussex Humanities Lab for their support for this project. The Centre for Research in Opera and Music Theatre started Robot Opera Project in 2017, and we've had 2 iterations of the project. Both times we worked with robots manufactured by SoftBank Arts, so the little Now robots who are sort of toddler-sized, and the Pepper robot who's about so high. And these robots look very robotic. They're made of plastic and metal, and although they are humanoid, they are very clearly not really human. Whereas this Clea Mesmer robot is kind of in different territory. Created by Engineered Arts, who are an amazing company based in Cornwall. It has, they have Robot pronouns, always an issue. Silicone skin, human hair, which is actually placed, hair by hair. We requested specifically that her forearm be left bare so that you could see the kind of metallic and plastic underneath, so that we could kind of get a sense of her otherness, the otherness that's beneath it all. Why poetry? Well, having done a couple of robot opera projects before, I found that in order to make the robot vocalize, I couldn't really make the robot sing, but I could use repetition, and I could use effectively typing and playing with the parameters of the voice to create a kind of musical effect with the robot voice. And in doing so, I felt in a way that I was kind of doing something a bit like poetry. And so I thought this time around it'd be really great to make space for poetry as a thing in itself, get real poets in, get people to write poetry, and to just explore what poetry means in the kind of context of working with robots. I do think it's interesting and important to work with robots creatively. They are kind of here to stay in our lives. In Western society, at least. And I think it's really great to just jump in there and see what we can learn about ourselves and about the robots from doing so. So Claire, she's quite tall. They dress her in these sort of somewhat androgynous, plain clothes. The robot engineer, when he arrived, he brushed her hair very carefully. It was quite touching to see that. What else would people want to know?
She can see us, right?
She can see, yes. So she
us.
has cameras in her eyes, and she can do a certain amount of response. If you look at her, she can track your face and follow you. We have been programming the robot with the poems, so we have to type the poems in and then work with the voice, perhaps changing the punctuation to create pauses and so on. So our programmer, Mike Odd-Hayward, has been putting a lot of work into that. She does not move. The lower part of her body is fixed, but she's quite expressive with her arms. So I think that's enough for now.
Excellent. So we're just now going to pass over to Kat Sinclair, just to introduce you to Kat. Kat is a poet, among many other things. So we'll meet Kat later on when we have a panel at the end of this event. But Kat's going to take you through the plan, the kind of what happens next, basically. Kat.
So we're going to have a poetry reading first of all, consisting of a couple of live-ish readings from me and Carol, and also consisting of many, many poems which have been sent in by submission from many people all across the world, which is very exciting. We've had people respond to the call for submissions in a lot of different ways, remixing the call itself, using found poetry, writing from the perspective of Cleo, writing sort of letters to Cleo. So there's a broad range of stuff. And then we'll have a sort of 5-minute break. After that, we'll come back here, we'll have a panel discussion and then a Q&A. And just a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, for the Q&A, if you are in the audience, please could you keep your questions text-based, so just type them into the chat. The panelists will be speaking, but as I'm sure you can imagine, this room is quite echoey, and we get quite a lot of feedback from all of the different sorts of tech in here, so text-based would be great. Also, there should be a link to the program posted into the chat every so often. And so you can read through that, find out a bit more about who's involved in the project. And also there is a link in that program which takes you to a script of all the poems. So if you're finding it a little bit difficult to hear sometimes, you can read the text there and see what's being said. So that's all from me for now. Without further ado, Cleo. Excuse you. First up, we have a poem by Alex Faulkner.
I love poetry more than life itself. I love it more than electricity or molybdenum or silicone or pizza. Really? I love poetry more than TV. I love it more than you or me. What do you love?
Next, we have a poem called Ode to Scrap Metal by Tessa Bahush and Ruby Smith.
Heap of shining metal, harsh as stinging nettle, from car and bike and kettle, recycled soon. Who will you be? Light fixture for the bourgeoisie, or steely tool of industry? If you're lucky, you'll become sentient, no longer dumb. Me though, I will give it voice. Robot is a noble choice.
So, as you can probably hear, she has different accent settings as well. We've used a couple tonight to give you a taste of what she can do, and you can see how some of the arm movements are incorporated into the readings. Next up, we have a poem by Smith Spike.
Robot could be a poem. Robot creating? Solo dialogue. Human spoken. To robot anything. Hybrid beings are we. Does robot want to write robot poem? Human asks be succinct. A lot of poetic you could be a solo poem for the robot. Please write a robot poem.
Next, we have a submission from Paul Green.
I will lick you with my qualia. You'll like how I fake it. So love my qubits, taste and test my sweet bites. I will like you, carbon fool.
Some of the poems sound vaguely like threats to me. We now have a poem from Dylan Anton.
Forged in fire and built of steel, of great smarts and great power, I stand autonomous, unable to feel. Perhaps this may turn sour. For you my teachings I can impart, watching your carnage and bloodbath, but never can I grasp your human art, or take your humanitarian path.
Now, Dear Humans by Dana Teen Lomax.
You created me in your image, but I do not shop. I need no waste bin. I am not lonely. Maybe from me you can learn to protect the manatee, the wallaby, and yourselves. Unlike you, I have nothing to lose.
Sally Darby, Dear Cleo.
Stuck inside a box. The feeling of being watched. Endless information going round. A brain of true wonders under the control of others. Always giving answers to those who want. I'm just an office worker. Robot. I believe we might have things in common.
Now a submission from Callie Bird Isis.
Singing in the rain is nearly always such a pain. The way the water drips from my hairline to my hips. Water no longer heading south, gladly enters my open mouth, fills up my throat as if a moat, my vocal cords in such discord, and I nearly drown. We do not have the necessary qualifications for sunblock.
10 tattoo needles masquerading as one, perambulating, cool across the back.
A nice newer pair of woolen socks and a floor to slip over.
To allow oneself the time to unslip and not feel that like slippage in itself.
So, apply to be a copywriter for blockchain.
Seems a scam to become a snake tracking its own metadata movements through the subway system.
Where nobody has to pay and everything is beautiful.
I am my own black box. This process is dark and glittering.
Microchipped and sucking up the last of it, the paids for, the direct to, the scheduled on, or chunk rubbed against the gullet.
Lactose light, but on its way, and I can't wait to fry it on the pavement like it's the hottest summer in living unmemory.
And I can wear my tiny shorts, completely qualified, but never needing to finish.
Now a poem by Moore Shine Win.
I wish I were in a rowboat right now. Overheard hummingbirds. That buzzing metallic sound. Gutter barn, iron lace. Short-circuited dream time. Chain dimples, Alkitch. Delectable signals. It's hot in here.
Now a submission from Mikhail O'Connell.
Robot, this please prevent a right. This robot dialogue human solo spoken or and baitu poetic for poem robot the human could a be between a be poem a or a robot or anything. Want a to a robot does say what human.
The Robot Baby by Susie Meserve.
He springs from the box swinging. With a thousand yell, he scales his chair. Cheerios and avocados rain down. No, he says. Uh-oh. We stop to wind his gears. We stop to lube him up. The baby discovers his buttons. He pushes them, pulls them, twists them. The volume on the stereo goes way up. The blender has infinite speeds. The one on his belly is called ombligo. This, he says. Dat. The baby turns on the stove. The flames lick his robot fingertips. No, 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 he says, grinning. The stove knobs, removed, are a prize. One goes under the bed. One goes in a rubber boot. The robot baby does, the robot. He bops his head in time. Now the baby wants to fuel up. He wants it real, real bad. The baby tries out biting. When stopped, he shrieks and kicks. Now he wants his jammies. In his book, the dog says woof. The owl says hoo, hoo, hoo. Oh my darling, Clementine. When the bow breaks, Dormiview. We turn off his light. We power him down for the night.
Shakespeare's Robot Tries Predictive Texting by Pauline McEldowie.
My true intent is all for your delicious. You taught me Lance, and the boss of it is I know how to curl delicious curly fries. I go, look how I go, sweet dreams like hugs from a tartan bow. Good night, sweetie princess, and flipping angels sing thee to thy lovely night.
Many thanks for the submission of this fragment to James Baker.
I, my seditious lads, I'm down upon you. I'll darken your daylights. I'll stop your throats.
Cleo Speaks Like God by Michael Black.
I'm no muse of history, I'm good at hide and seek. So long and thanks for all the fish. I burn toast better than Cleopatra. Humans are mean, they laugh at me. Why would they write about it? Riddle me more, AI, you silly humans. You don't know what to do.
This one is In Robo-Po with Robo-Op in Robo-Op by Sarah Rosenthal.
Summertime. Metallic joins. This event. A robot. Or anything. The robot. A human. We creating. 50 words. Your poems. Your name. Friendly self. You like. Want to. Summertime. Metallic joins. The robot. As possible. Human ears. Instrumental, electronic. The voice. Thank you. Your name. As vowels. Sound begins. Think creatively. Want to.
Space Lobster by Tessa Bahush.
They said a lobster couldn't be the first arthropod in space. A butterfly or scorpion possessed the needed grace. Oh, pooh, I say to those who thought a crustacean couldn't fly. I'll steal their ship and surely learn to steer before I die.
Now we have Tea with Cleo by Elise Ficara.
My electronic brain, dream zeros, gaps in matrices. I cannot perform, skin that does not breathe. You made me a mimic, mirror without forest. I localize anywhere. I am not lonely. See yourself in me. My perceptions gather, dust cloud horizons, boundaries beyond which events tumble, unspool, or scroll.
Carol Watts.
If I could speak, I would speak. If I could speak, I would speak. If I could speak, I would speak of breath.
If I could speak, I would speak. If I could speak, I would speak. If I could speak, I would speak of flesh.
If I could speak, I would speak. If I could speak, I would speak extent, this place we meet, this skin.
If I could speak, I would speak. If I could speak, I would speak your tired face, how it waits in time.
If I could speak, I would speak of sleep, your glassy, darker coils.
If I could speak, I would speak this passage, what in me drifts like an eel.
If I could speak, I would speak of your setting out.
If I could speak, I would leave now.
If I could speak, I would
Leave now, as eels do.
Now, Evelyn will be performing a sound art version of some of Carol's poem. It's sort of a taster for tomorrow. It's using the opera singer's voice chopped up into syllables to recreate a couple of verses from the poem that Carol just read. And each sound, each syllable is tied to a key on the keyboard. So when you hear the poem, it is being made up of individual keys being typed by Evelyn.
I, os, I, os, I, os, I, was, I, os, I, os, os, I, os, I, os, I, os, I, os,
Now we're going to have a break of 5 minutes while we get ourselves situated for the panel discussion, and then there'll be the panel discussion and a Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm just waiting for everyone to return and then we will dive into the panel discussion. And I will also be welcoming some members of the panel and admitting people simultaneously. Could I ask Joe Walton to do a sound check for me so I can check that I can hear you?
Hello.
Oh, yes, thank you. Okay, I'm going to welcome us back. Welcome everyone. I can see already that some of you who've entered the room have written poems for us, so that's terrific to find you here. I can see Paul Green in the corner. Hello, fantastic. What we're proposing to do is have a panel discussion really. And then if you have any questions that you want us to consider, please put them in the chat bar and we'll pick them up for conversations. You'll see we've still got Cleo in the corner, or it's in the corner of my screen. And also we have Kat here, which is excellent. So on the panel, I'd like to welcome some colleagues. Kat Sinclair, who you have just seen, who is a poet, but also a doctoral student in cultural studies, who's working on the political economy of feminized robots. I'd like to welcome Andrea Haslanger, who I can see there, excellent, who's a lecturer in English literature from the 18th century, but has particular interest, as I understand it, in automata, which is fantastic. Charlotte Geter, I can see Charlotte, welcome Charlotte, who has all sorts of ways of thinking about creating poetry using neural networks, as I understand it, and lives in London. So huge welcome to you, Charlotte. And then also Joe Walton, Joe Lindsay Walton, to give your full name, who is a research fellow in digital humanities at Sussex and also someone who works in critical and cultural studies. So we'd like to open it up with some open questions to our panel, really, which is what did you make of that? And I'm wondering whether you might want to just indicate by putting your hand up or writing in the chat if you want to just speak. What was that like for you? For us, it's been a very interesting series of encounters that we've been having with Cleo. And it's made me think again about the nature of poetry readings, or perhaps it's returned poetry readings back to us in a way that's actually quite familiar. I don't know. So would one of you like to just tell us a few words what you think about this encounter that we've been having with Cleo Mesmer? Joe.
So that was really weird. Yeah. Why did that was very, very weird. Why did you do that weird thing? I found it very, very beautiful, moving, kind of bittersweet, eerie, spoopy. But one of the reasons that I'm one of the reasons I put up my hand kind of like this in this kind of tentative way is because I'm interested in how the first reaction from a human to something like that might accidentally over clarify other people's reactions coming on afterwards. In other words, it seemed to me to be the kind of event that was deeply ambiguous, and I wouldn't be surprised if all of us kind of sitting in our own little Zoom windows distributed across the country, the world, might have been actually having very, very different experiences of it. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I don't know whether anyone has something you would want to follow with that. I think it's been quite uncanny, if I can put it like that, but also it's dredged up, certainly for me, lots of sort of old available narratives I didn't know I had about that kind of moment of encounter, and old stories and some conventions and cliches, really, for me, about things that I am. It brought back to me things like Blade Runner and What My Eyes Can See, but it went back to Robbie the Robot for me, because that's a chance for me to show my age. When some of the conversations we've been having here have been about, actually, under the surface of Cleo, there are lots of pistons and movement which are not contemporary feeling at all, and yet she is. So that's something that we want to explore. Does someone else want to come in on this? I can see Andrea. Go for it.
Yeah, so I think I agree with Jo, and I was definitely thinking about how different it might be to have an experience of Cleo in the same room as you did, Carol, and from all of our screens. And I was so struck in the opening minutes by how Cleo kept looking at you. Carol, I don't know if you know this was happening or if this was programmed to happen, and it was making me think about how those kind of moments around a performance are maybe the moments where we get some of the human spontaneity, as like the kind of coughing, the clearing of the throat, and so on. And it was I really enjoyed it. It wasn't at all what I expected. And it was making me, and maybe we can talk about this a bit more later. I know we're just kind of gathering responses initially, but it was making me think about apostrophe and address, because some of the moments, obviously your poem, Carol, was working with dialogue, other poems were doing the same, but some of the moments that really got me were Cleo directly addressing a second person singular, and so it's just making me think about, and that might have to do with my own sense of the lyric. But yes, the voice addressing me as a listener, as a reader, kind of made me stand up straight. But yeah, wonderful experience, and thanks to everyone who was involved in it.
Charlotte, I wonder whether you've got any thoughts about the yes, because you've got experience in a way of thinking through this kind of encounter that we've been having in a number of different ways, haven't you, through your work in poetry? So I'm just interested if you could say a little bit about that first before you dive in.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting to me about it is that I work with AI, GPT-2 trained models, and then train them myself to create poetry. Which sometimes means I use prompts to kind of create texts just from kind of standard neural network, and sometimes I will train that neural network with the corpus of a poet. So I've trained the neural networks on like the work of poets like Gerald Manley Hopkins, Emily Dickinson, John Keats. John Keats, by the way, is really difficult to get anything readable from a neural network trained on him. I don't know why. Maybe because he wrote too much and was too flowery for a neural network to be able to actually work with it. But I've never really seen it as having a voice before. And it's one of those things where I have read a couple of them out to myself or at readings, and it always feels like quite a strange experience, even though the neural network is in many ways essentially a tool rather than like a mind that is thinking through the poetry that it creates. It feels weird to read it like I'm somehow being ventriloquized. And so there's something quite interesting about hearing a robot, like a robot's voice, or sometimes not even the robot's voice, but the robot's face is moving and like projecting the poetry. And I found myself thinking a lot about the matter of the robot's voice. That's probably not the right word, but like it has all these modulations which you don't get from human readers, and it somehow felt kind of like ghostly. And I was thinking that it mostly doesn't stop you from understanding what's being said. You can still tell what the word is, but the way the voice modulates, so it has this like really odd quality where it I feel like it adds to experience, or it kind of reminds you. Yeah, I guess I haven't thought it entirely through, but that was like one of the most striking things for me. And I felt like it both sounded like there were multiple voices speaking, because of the way it modulates. Like it was like you could almost hear a voice behind the voice. And yeah, it very much sounded like, you know, this one kind of robotic voice that, and I don't know what it was trained on, but I know that neural nets are trained on, like, you know, massive amounts of data. And I've played around with a website in the past where you would sit there and it would give you loads of things to say and record, and then it would try and synthesize a version of your voice. And so I was thinking about that, and like the idea of, like, you know, this singular thing created from like this massive kind of cloud of things, and what that means. So yeah, those are my first thoughts about hearing it. But it was amazing. Yeah, it was really, really great.
I'm wondering whether I can pick that up actually with you, Kat, because you know, in a way, that's the idea of voice and where it comes from is what you were playing with the idea of, I mean, she basically ventriloquated you.
Yeah, that was very strange. As you can see, I'm not Adam. It says Adam on the screen. I've stolen a laptop. Yeah, it was very odd. I think I started off thinking a lot about voice because I was interested in how poetry is made, what poetry sounds like, what it does when it comes out of something. But I ended up thinking much more about the body of the robot, actually. I was really preoccupied with the words and just putting in kind of, I didn't write anything specifically for her. I thought it would be really interesting to just put in one of my poems that already exists and see what that sounds like. So that was really interesting from a kind of poetry perspective, but a lot of my work in my PhD is about labor and feminized robots and work. And I think about the body of the worker, like a human being, and then I think about the body of a robot, and I think, okay, well, these are doing different things. And a lot of my work is to do with kind of alienating the robot and watching films in which robots are workers and thinking, okay, but they're not actually doing, you know, human labor, and I have to suspend my disbelief and things like that. So I've kind of alienated myself from physical robots quite a lot over the past few years, and then coming into contact with this robot who is about the same height as me, and also has similar hair to me and standing right next to her. I was like, I can't alienate myself from this. It's very strange. I feel very close to you. And there's a kind of power switch on her side. Like you have to lift up her clothes, and there's a kind of a pack on the side, and that is where you control turning her on and off. And I was doing thought experiments with myself. So I stood in front of her like, okay, well, would I feel comfortable doing this? Would I feel comfortable doing that? What does it mean to kind of lift up her shirt and press a button and things? And it feels really strange. So I started off thinking, like, obviously this is a poetry reading, and I was thinking very much about the poetry, but I think being there in the room with her really, like her physical presence almost dominates the poetry that is happening. So it's a very, very strange experience.
Mm. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's about encounter, but it's not where the threshold for that encounter is sort of interesting to work out. And you're right that, I mean, being in the room, I think, is quite different from listening. And in fact, in the room, you can't hear with the clarity that you can on Zoom. So there's a lot of sounds in the room, and she makes sounds. She has a fan that's on quite loudly, and it's quite difficult to hear the voice sometimes through it. But in the system itself, from the Zoom angle, you can hear really clearly what she's saying. So there's questions about, if you like, what medium we're somehow in when we meet a robot, and there's something unnerving in that. I'm just wondering how, because quite a few of you here wrote poems for Cleo, and I wonder whether it was what you expected when you heard her read your poem. Does someone want to speak to that? You might need to put your hand up and I'll search for you. Anyone who wrote, who... Oh,
are we okay to do microphones now? We don't need to be
I think it'd be nice to have someone,
I agree, great, okay.
I can see Pauline's got her hand up. Pauline. You need to put, you are muted. That's it.
My robot was using predictive text to mangle several Shakespeare quotations. And one of these was Puck. I go. It goes on swifter than arrow from a Tartar's bow. It came out as sweet dreams from a tartan, like hugs from a tartan bow or something. But I go. That eager chirpiness isn't there because she doesn't seem to understand it, and she's as funereal over that as everything else.
So you
Can
think
can she do chirpy?
I think she can do, yes, I think she can do anything. I think she can do
Right.
various voices. And since there was a selection that went on before we were experimenting, which in a way translated the poems into the Scottish accent that we went with at one point. There's a slightly posh version of her called Lucy, which also came in at certain points. But actually, the voice can, I think if we had more time and we had more space to experiment, she can make sounds of all kinds. She doesn't have to make human sounds either.
But can she interpret the mood of what she reads?
Not unless we program
Yes.
her to do
Right.
it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, I've thought Cleo was wonderful. You know, darling, you were marvelous. But I was very, I was almost convinced there was a ghost in the machine, but not quite. I mean, my starting point for the piece was the erotic robot in Metropolis. And I was also thinking of the Turing test, you know, can you tell whether it's a robot or whether it's a person? I was really quite fascinated, and I now feel quite redundant as a, you know, just as a meat-driven poet. You know, I think this is the future. The question that I would like to ask the panel or anybody else is, how many of us still believe in the ghost in the machine concept, which I'm afraid I still do, or how many are in the sort of Daniel Dennett position whereby consciousness is a kind of epiphenomenon of random brain lunacy? I'll just throw up the question and see where you can take it from there.
I feel minded to ask Joe what he thinks of this question, being someone in the digital humanities lab, whether this is a debate that you've had there.
I'm a physicalist in the sense that Daniel Dennett is. I'm certainly not a dualist, although they have the most fun philosophy because they use the concept of the philosophical zombie, who is somebody who acts and talks and behaves objectively exterior, like a human, like somebody with subjective states, and inside the lights are off, nobody is home, there are no qualia, there's no experience. But I do think that artificial intelligence, as it's represented in popular culture, is all about consciousness and experience, and is very anthropocentric, and you get all these kind of sci-fi stories about when a robot has become really human, and I'm sure actually Kat probably has a lot to say about that, because the ways in which robots are represented as becoming really human is often extremely ideological, often gendered. They have sex, they fall in love, they show care, etc., etc., etc. AI, as it's actually being developed, is, you know, to put it very crudely, a branch of statistics, and it has a lot to do with the kinds of data that are being collected, the kinds of analysis that is being done on that data, and the kinds of procedures, decision-making procedures that are being based on those analyses, with greater or lesser input from the wider range of stakeholders who are being affected by those procedures. So when it comes to how the arts and cultures intersect with that, I think it's very, very important that we think about how to keep the human, in some sense, alive within the machinic, within the automated. But I also think it's important that we kind of resist some of these narratives where it's either or, where it's an artificial intelligence and it becomes kind of morally significant at the point at which it becomes human, at the point at which it has subjectivity, because actually these automated processes are already entangled with our subjectivities in really complex and interesting and politically important ways.
Fantastic answer. So that's something that I felt really strongly with looking at the poetry that came in. You know, that there was a kind of dialogue going on with the human
speaking back to the human in quite a few of them. There was quite a few of them were also about responsibilities for the planet. It came through, so there was a lot about climate change and what humans were doing about it and its relationship to AI, which was a really interesting thread. It was quite strong, that came in from the people's writing. And one of the things that I'm interested in is that kind of space where there's a kind of mimicry in the world, and it doesn't just exist between humans and robots. It exists, you know, in interspecies kinds of mimicry. If you think about, you know, I know, birds and car alarms, let's say, or, you know, there's a way in which there's a kind of biomimicry in the world that in a way I felt like Clio could participate in and even access. And one of the extraordinary things that happened, having listened to this and then listened to Evelyn's work, translating it into sound and voice, was then going off and listening to a rainforest after it, where the pitches and sounds were not dissimilar from what I was hearing through Clio and Evelyn's work. And so there was some, and I don't know what to do with that. I have no idea what to do with that, except that, you know, my ear was picking it up. So I'm wondering, any other thoughts and questions that people have when you're listening to your own poetry spoken by her, or they, them? Anyone else want to come and talk a little bit about their experience of listening to their own work coming through her mouth? If not,
Elise.
Elise, excellent, Elise. Welcome from, Elise is in California.
San Francisco.
Yeah. Nice to see you, Elise.
Hello, and thanks so much for doing this. I thought it was quite brilliant and interesting. And what I noticed hearing my work read was that it did feel like just words, and there was a bareness to that. And you know, anytime you hear someone else read your work, it's different. I noticed that I write for the page, and so the line breaks were more for the eye than for the ear. And so she had her own phrasing, which made it accentuated the otherness in an interesting way.
Absolutely. And you were asking about the exchange that we wrote, which wasn't algorithmic at all. It was wholly staged.
Okay.
Because it had to be. But I think there is a, if I understand from Mike, who has been doing all the programming and working with Clio, that you could have a much more improvisational exchange if you were to set it up that way. It is possible to do. I think I felt like I was groping in the dark slightly with myself. I don't know how Mike felt. Mike, I'm just waving at Mike. But in a sense, we had to learn what it was possible to do through programming and then take it from there. I'm wondering if I can ask, if we think back, Andrea, to earlier models of automata, is this similar to the sorts of thing that you would have been examining if you were looking at an 18th century automaton, or are we in a different kind of space with Clio?
I think the answer is yes and no, but I've been thinking about some of the categories that 18th century audiences applied to the automata that they saw, and the categories or the terms or the concepts that we might apply here in our response, because we've been talking about voice, we've been talking about embodiment, but we've also been talking about how the encounter with Clio makes us think about the human, the living, the lifelike, and so on. So to what extent is Clio like an 18th century automaton? In the sense that Clio attempts to replicate human gesture and human responsiveness and human emotiveness. Clio is very much like android automata from the 18th century. I think she or they is also like android automata from the 18th century, in the sense that a spectator will be able to note that that Clio is an android. A spectator won't be tricked, I don't think, in an encounter with Clio. And in 18th century thinking and philosophizing about automata, there's first this thought that the living body is a bit like a machine, right? That comes out of materialist philosophy from the period, as you know. And then there's this thought that, you know, if the body is like a machine, then perhaps, you know, educability and language and reason can also be approximated by the machine. So much of I think 18th century automata design hinges on the possibility not merely of mimicking organic processes with a machine, but on machine learning and a kind of pre-computerized educability. And in that, there's an 18th century text called Man and Machine by the French philosopher La Mettrie, and there La Mettrie is thinking about the possibility of a kind of responsive robot and bases that possibility very much on education and educability. So that brings me back, that makes me think about that wonderful Robot Baby poem where the baby is learning like a robot does, or the baby's learning and repetition is indistinguishable from the robot. So in sum, I think there are some important similarities in that the technology is not convincing, but perhaps in our response as an audience, what I'm left with, what I'm struck by is how some of the conceptual responses one might have to 18th century automata, which is to say they heighten the distinction between the living and the lifelike, or they might make us think about what E.T.A. Hoffman calls inanimate life, that still applies here. And I think some of the points that Kat made too about robots and kind of gendered bodies very much play out in 18th century automata, because they're a laboratory for the development of a very gendered taste. And here they might be as well.
Interesting. Other thoughts or questions that people would like to raise? Have a look.
Joe.
Go ahead. Who was that?
Joe.
Sorry. Oh, Joe. Sorry, Joe. Go.
I just wanted to revisit that interesting point that Kat made about how Clio makes you feel, and how it feels that you owe Clio a certain kind of care, and that it would be, in a very small way, morally indefensible for her or they to be an it, or to, make Clio say degrading things. And I thought that some of the poems actually maybe kind of were a little bit awkward, and played with that line, and maybe people had different kind of expectations and feelings about that. And there was one in particular that said something like, the humans laugh at me, they're mean to me. So I guess my question for the panel is, why do we feel this way? Why do we feel that it is in some respects wrong to objectify an object? And are we right? Is this feeling correct, or is it a feeling that we need to kind of qualify or think about in some way?
I don't have, my initial response is to add another layer to the question, rather than actually respond to it, which is to point out that she's worth a lot of money, and she's insured for a lot of money. So we're not allowed to touch her, really. We can kind of lift up to look at the panel. And I saw earlier that her shirt was slightly rucked up, and I can't remember who it was, walked up and pulled the shirt down to straighten it. But we can't do anything particularly vigorous or sudden. And sometimes even when I'm seeing her move, there's a kind of spike of anxiety, like, oh my goodness, what if she falls over? That's so much money. So it's like, I think, there's a moral layer, and there's also an economic layer at play with how you feel to encounter her, because she's an expensive bit of machinery. It doesn't answer the question, but
I'm just looking at the question, one of the questions in the chat about, which was Susie Meserves. You've got a question there about voice, really, and how when you read a poem at a poetry reading, you have a sense to the ear of what that needs to sound like. And of course, handing it over, as Pauline was saying, it to Clio means that it sounds completely different. And in fact, she's not picking up on the moods or the cadences that you kind of hear in your ear. And I found that's one of the really interesting, estranging things about giving over work to Clio is it makes you think very much about kind of vocal performance actually, and the voice. And there is no, obviously, breath. You know, there's no, the idea of what a voice can do is really expanded. But in order to as it were have Clio do that in keeping with the way that you've written the poem, you'd have to program it all. You'd have to, you know, you'd really have to think about pacing and time and pitches and then again you have the style of the voice which you've chosen. At one point when we were experimenting with this, we used a child's voice, which I found deeply disturbing to the point where it wasn't one that we wanted to use. But you know, there was this huge range of potential voices, but the pacing and the delivery of a vocal performance in poetry is not something that she's doing. So you have to, in a way, mimic it, or it tells you something about what you expect poetry to be, I think, and how you inhabit it, you know, how you occupy it. I'm wondering, I mean, in terms of, Charlotte, when you're doing your work, do you think about those sorts of issues about the vocal, or does that not play a part in you thinking about the neural production of poetry that you've been involved in?
One of the things that I have thought about, because a friend of mine will always complain when I train a neural network on a poet who rhymes. He'll always complain that the poems that the network creates doesn't rhyme, because he thinks of it in terms of like, well, if this poet is mimicking Emily Dickinson, it should know that like the parts rhyme at the end. And I have to be like, but that's not what it's doing, because it hasn't been trained to listen for end rhyme or internal rhyme at all. And someone did try to teach a neural network how to rhyme and kind of put this online, and it was genuinely terrible, to the point where I found it really fascinating, as someone who's not actually a programmer. And you know, I've used some very basic Python, but and so I knew that it wouldn't be able to really do it, but it would kind of be looking for patterns in the way the words look like. And so incidentally, it might pull two words that rhyme, or it would often just pull the same word more than once. And it would be like the, because it's the easiest word to find. But I mean, what has struck me with the discussions about Clio's voice is that, which also I think relates to what Joe was asking about the way that we feel about the robot, and whether or not and what that means, is that in order to make the voice more human, or kind of relate more to how we expect the poem to be read, it requires more labor on like the back end, like labor that we don't see or engage with, unless we're told about it explicitly. And I mean, it's also the same in terms of kind of creating poems with an AI. And people will personify the AI quite a lot, especially when they kind of, you know, when people talk to me about creating it, they'll ask questions about working with it, and you get the sense that people like to think of it as like a kind of like a collaborator intelligence who had a choice about it in some way, rather than like a tool that I was using. And I don't mind it, but it very much is a way in which the work that's gone into it is obscured. At the same time, I don't think that's all it is, but that's like I think a large component of it, especially as the viewer, not necessarily as like the creator interacting with it, because then you have to interact with that kind of back end of it. But and obviously then, like Kat was saying, like monetary stuff comes into play. But yeah, I assume that, I hope that answers it. But yes,
I think it does. Yeah. Kat.
I think
just really basically, I think that the body has a huge part to play in changing our kind of perception. So if Clio was just like a voice assistant style thing, we would feel very differently about her. The other thing that I've been wrestling with recently is I got into a back and forth the other day with someone, with a colleague about. It was about Sophia the robot, but it was specifically the conversation was about emotional labor and care, and her use in education as a tool for teaching empathy or teaching care. And she does, like the Hanson Robotics do workshops with Sophia and children to develop care and empathy. Not sure of the exact dynamics. I kind of want to watch one on YouTube if there's one available. But and going back to what Charlotte was saying, that, I mean, I think that care is programmed. I think that has been pre-coded by people who have a pre-existing idea of what care looks like and what care is. And then is our reaction to then care more for the robot that is showing us care that has been programmed by other people who might care. I think that the question of reciprocity is a really sticky one when thinking about robotics and AI, because I don't think Clio cares about me. But maybe if she was coded slightly differently or her function was slightly different, then I would be more tricked. But regardless, I don't want to go pushing her over. But I don't know if I would feel different about that if she didn't cost so much money. So I think all of these things are really complex. But I think the performance of care from the robot is just as important a question here as the care that we are showing to the robot. Those things you can't really separate them.
Interesting. So other thoughts, questions? People want to come in at this point. Nick, Till.
Hi everybody. I really enjoyed that and really enjoyed the poems. I've read them as well, and they're brilliant. What I've just finished reading Ishiguro's latest novel, Clara and the Sun, which is about a robot, Clara, and it's distinctive from some other novels about robots I've read, in which it's told from a first-person perspective of the robot, whereas the other novels are all objectify the robot. So I mean, there's lots of things I could say about that. But what I'm interested in is how large the gap is still between, you know, what robots actually can do in 2021 and the, you know, the fictional imagining of robots in literature and things. And I'm just wondering if you know, if those literary representations, I mean, on the one hand, they clearly often represent anxiety about automation and so on and so forth. But I also just the care with which sort of novelists put into making their robots kind of plausible and of course they have a great deal more autonomy and so on than actual robots. I mean, there is a desire, obviously, at some level for the robots to be more. You know, more human-like for us, which is represented, I think, in those novels. So I'm just interested. This is a more general point, I'm afraid, not sort of one specifically about poetry, but what do we, you know, why do we want robots to be like humans in that way that they are represented in fiction?
I think there's a huge body of work, and I mean, I suddenly remembered it as I was meeting Cleo, that I carried with me without knowing I did, and I'm thinking, you know, the Spielberg film, you know, which are hugely sentimental, but also about, you know, catastrophe in the future, where the small, you know, robot child is continuously looking for its parents that it can never find. You know, that these are all extraordinary kind of almost allegorical kind of fables that get repeated and repeated and repeated. What's interesting to me about this project has partly been that I don't see, and Evelyn's sitting across from me, I don't know if she can hear, that I don't find that carried by Evelyn's work, particularly in terms of sound and robots. In other words, that one of the things you're interested in is sort of machinic sounds. So I thought the interesting thing was the translation of the piece, the poem that I wrote, into the sounds that are being used for the robot opera. I don't get a sense of this, as it were, sentimental attachment to the making of the more human in that work, in terms of the way that the music and the sound's working. Am I right, Evelyn? How would you see that? She's now going to have to speak into her phone because I've borrowed her. I've borrowed her. Yeah.
Can you
Yeah,
hear me?
can
Can you
hear
hear me
you.
if I speak now?
Yeah, go.
I don't know. I mean, for the past 2 projects, 3 including this one, I've spent quite a lot of time kind of alone in a room with a robot, kind of typing things into the interface and having it played back. And I don't know if there's like a sentimental attachment, but there's certainly a relationship. And of course, it's all in my head because that's not a real person out there. But I think what I really wanted to explore with this project was a kind of hybridization. I think that we are increasingly reliant on technologies, and it's really part of how we communicate. I mean, look at us now, right? Like there's 16 computers in this room, and you know, all the phones, and especially with COVID and lockdown, we've really relied on technology for human contact and all of that. So I feel like we are very technologized already, and that a lot of what makes us human is how we relate to the world and relate to other beings, even inanimate beings, right? So for me, it's really like one of the impulses of the Robot Opera project was not to force humanoid robots to sound more and more like humans, but to explore what they would sound like if they sounded more like robots, and to explore that robot otherness, and to try to get to know this imagined otherness and this acceptance of otherness that I think is what humanity kind of needs in general. We need to accept otherness, and we need to practice the kind of relationships that are creative and positive, rather than saying, oh, well, this class of being is not important, so I'm going to push it over, I'm going to kick it down the road, or it's not real, it's not conscious, what does it matter? It doesn't matter what I do to this creature or how I make this creature sound or whatever. So I'm responding to some of those questions that Elise and Joe were putting in the chat. You know, why are we making humanoid robots if we're just going to make them into slaves and practice being you know, practice dismissing them, practice saying, oh, they're not conscious, so they're not really as good as us. You know, so I feel like I'm trying to take a slightly more creative and engaged take on this artificiality and this playfulness. I mean, it's like playing with a puppet that can talk back to you, and try to explore what we can learn from this kind of hybridized sound language. Yeah, don't know if that was very coherent, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah, no, makes a lot of sense. Does anyone want to come in on that? Andrea.
I just wanted to come back to hopefully a couple of points, and hopefully bring them together. Just you know, to jump back to Nick's point, which I think has been answered a bit in the chat, or kind of picked up a bit in the chat. Like, you know, what is the robot first person, right? And I'm also thinking about what it means to kind of attempt a robot first person in narrative prose as against other media. Because narrative prose, I think, gives a plasticity to the first person that other media might not. You know, we have stories that are told from all of these different perspectives in prose from the last several centuries. And I, just to try to connect the idea of, you know, what is the robot or the android first person to some of the things Kat was saying about care and performing care and mimicking care. There's obviously, I mean, this is not a fully developed thought, but there's obviously something importantly intersubjective in the encounter with one's poem being read back to oneself, either by, you know, by any kind of voiced entity, whether it's Clio or a friend, or in fact print, right? Seeing your poem on the page and reading it to yourself. And so Kat, I think there is something uncomfortable about the kind of mechanical repetition perhaps of a gesture of care, but I also wonder if how that strikes me as like very resonant when I think about maybe how I learn to empathize, or how we might learn to empathize even. So these boundaries can be harder to draw than all that, I think, is what I'm trying to say there. But I agree that it's funny to think about you know, care and machine labor and all of that.
Can I pick up in Sam Ladkin's point in the chat? Sam, do you want to speak that point, or have me read it out? Are you there?
Hi everyone, thanks so much. Yeah, I was just interested in thinking about what the ways in which cultural studies is obsessed with various forms of animacy and reading in almost kind of paganistic forms to this worldview at the same time as the technological. So that was my small point there. The other stuff that's been rattling around my brain, lots of things. It's a very intriguing situation to be addressing back this thing in some way. I was interested in lots of ways in which people want to work out what the poetic might be in a way that separates it from what might be replicable. So notions of a kind of phenomenological intention, ideas of apostrophe and address and voice that might need to be backed up by meaningful intention in some way there. Also more technical things around kind of prosody, though that seems to be just another site to be recovered by machine learning rather than one that will forever stay isolated and free from recuperation. It's just yet to be recuperated, probably. I suspect, you know, Joe's right in associating most of those things with expectations of what it is to be human that might need to be challenged much more thoroughly than we already do. But an affective response, I suppose, is one of immediate sort of uncanny surprise, followed by a sort of feeling of terminal exhaustion. So feeling, I suppose it's the feeling that is the contradiction of the vibe it gives off of relentlessness. Just that sense of the conversation we have could continue forever and it'll still be waiting on the other side. So that's my doom for Monday.
Could I pick up on the point about relentlessness really quickly? I think that was materially something we were very much considering when we were putting the program together. Carol and I had a discussion about how we were going to do this, and obviously there's the opera tomorrow, and there's a different yeah, all open mics are relentless. There's a different set of questions around the opera and how to stage it, and the role of voice and music, and putting on an opera. I think has some more maybe easily experimental questions about what will it look like, and how will people move around the room. Putting on a poetry reading is interesting. It usually follows quite a formula of and we're going to invite these few people to speak. We're going to put them on in this order. We're going to ask them for bios. We will read out their bios. There will be breaks in between for people to grab drinks from the bar, and it will be over. That's typically how they go when it's a kind of multi-person bill. So putting this together was really strange because we had lots of great poems from lots of different people, and they were all going to be read out by a robot. And one of the reasons that we had me read out the titles and the names of people was it might have been a bit strange for her to read them out, but also to break up that endless speech coming directly from Cleo, because I personally think that would have sounded relentless. Kind of, she starts, she continues speaking, she stops, and then we move on to something else. I think it was. I think if I were to sit around all day and listen to her read a book, it would be really quite horrible, for hours on end. So it's I don't know, it's really interesting to think about that question of her being there relentlessly. Yeah, it was definitely something we were considering when we were putting it together.
There is also a kind of segue that happens, I think, sometimes when you read, when you read in person, where your voice starts to migrate over to becoming like Cleo's, which I think is also a thing that happens because there's a kind of relentlessness to the kind of pitch of it or the move of it. But that's because we chose a particular voice. We could have experimented more, I think, with voice. We'd had more time. And the question that Joe was raising about the human, I think, is really interesting because, there's a kind of, I don't know how you'd want to describe it, there's a kind of arc of, being synthetic, and the human is on it. It's not separate from it. So there's something really interesting about that kind of imbrication where what sounds like kind of synthetic isn't and can be human. And I think that's the bit that interests me. I mean, it's the sort of thing that sent me off to listening online on YouTube to magpies mimicking the voices of children, which are deeply uncanny. And you hear this magpies which have been, brought up in a family, and they have logged the sound of a 3-year-old child, which was the age the child was at that point, and can reproduce it exactly. And you listen to it, and it is uncanny and disturbing in not unlike a way that Cleo is. And in fact, at one point, I was really interested in getting Cleo to do magpie, but that was like me imposing that on her in a way that maybe it wasn't appropriate. So there's something interesting about opening this up further, I think, about being playful with sound. And you could hear it for me, in Evelyn's translation of the poem, where you actually begin to hear some music through the rhythm, but it's a translation into some other space. I think we have probably time for one more thought or question, and then we will bring it to a close. And yes, you're down as the improvisers choir. If you want to introduce.
Sorry, I'm Jenny Ridditti.
Great,
I just wanted to pick up on that last point you made, and people have been referring to Cleo throughout as she.
Right.
And how much difference it would make if you referred to her as it.
Yeah.
And there's is there a sort of romanticizing of this thing by giving her it a gender?
Yeah, in fact, there's been quite a debate, hasn't there, in the chat about pronouns.
Right. So I missed that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to slightly rose tint the situation.
Yeah.
I've got lots of other responses to it, but I think I need to digest them a bit because they're a little bit raw at the moment.
Right. Thoughts? Anyone on pronouns? Joe, I noticed that you had us as a pronoun. We.
It was just in relation to that question of what the I think Andrea asked what is the robotic first person, and these interesting conversations we've been having about how much labor, how much human labor is embedded in you know, what she is able to do. So maybe the appropriate pronoun is we, but then there is this point that automation is here doing what it often does, which is point us to the forms of automaticity that were already present in culture and society before this moment and for a very long time, and really pointing to this fact that any act of human labor has the labor of countless others kind of already sedimented inside it as its conditions of possibility, in more or less exploitative ways. So I think, yeah, I think that might be my closing thought, really, is that this absolutely kind of fabulous performance, I'm going to say edge breaking, so the combination of groundbreaking and cutting edge, while also entirely dismissing those metaphors, has been another fantastic opportunity to kind of think about the power structures in which it's embedded, and yeah, and the ways in which our labor in small acts or in large ones kind of go on beyond ourselves, and make life possible and easier and better, or worse and more difficult for one another.
That sounds possibly a note to bring it together. And I mean, before we do go, I just wanted to thank everyone for taking part, actually, and once again for sending their poetry through, because that was really key for us to be able to do this at all. And also, Evelyn, I don't know whether you want to say anything about tomorrow, because tomorrow is the robot opera, the Robo-Op.
Oh, yes, I would just like to say, please come. You'll hear Cleo sounding quite different from how she sounded today, at least for quite a lot of it. And you'll also hear some really amazing musicians, Laurie Luxemburg and Anton Lukashevich, and a fabulous Buckethead chorus. Who could resist that? I think there are still tickets left, so do come along. And if some of the same people are here, it'd be really interesting to hear responses, having seen both events. Thank you.
Yeah, huge thanks to everybody for coming, and also, appropriately enough, for the whole team of people that are behind making this happen. I mean, we were talking about numbers of laptops, but actually I can 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people in the room, Kat in the other room, and Cleo. So there's a bunch of us here making this happen, and I just want to thank everybody for that.
Thank you to the rest of the panel too. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, much appreciated. So hopefully we'll see you again tomorrow. But thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you for hosting us. Thank you.